as it was told to me. And I began to use this story as a teaching vehicle. You see, my ideas are entirely mathematical. You know, it's as if nobody ever thought about this before, and I rethought the whole thing out. I got to each of its imperfections. I started from its imperfections. I worked to its root and fixed everything. And, you know, with all the thinking that's involved, we come to a very simple answer, as usually the case. E equals mc squared is a very simple expression. It means a lot of things, but E equals mc squared is a very simple expression. In any case, I resolved all these things, and because I was invited to this lecture, and I show up and the man speaks, and in the process of this speech, he quoted Jefferson and Franklin, as I said several times, and what he said so profoundly affected me. I mean, I don't rub elbows with economists. Anytime an economist, or however many hundreds of economists, and I are in the same room, it's one against all of them. You know, it's not that I can't be a gentleman amongst them or anything like that. It's like we have completely disparate schools of thinking, which are mutually exclusive and adverse to each other. So when this man gave this speech at one presentation on economy in 1975, you know, at one point he quoted Thomas Jefferson, and you'll find this quote all over the internet now. Although I was told, you know, soon after I published it, that Jefferson never said this, you know, and in truth, I've never found an actual historic account that he did, but at the same time, I'm a relative of Thomas McKeon, who was the last man to sign the Declaration of Independence, because he left before it was ready for signing to help Washington, you know, command troops for the Revolution. He was the second president of the United States under the Articles of Confederation. I'm, you know, of Scottish descent, and you know, and the McKeon family from Scotland. And I know that the family has quite a bit of material, or used to say it did at least, between letters between Thomas McKeon, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington in particular. They were close, and it's quite possible that, you know, academia has no right to just say, because we don't know about it, it doesn't exist, you know. So it's quite possible that this man, Jacques Walker, who I lost contact with, actually had evidence. I know he was a tremendously well-read man, and the thing about his presentation is he had no reason whatsoever to obfuscate this statement of Jefferson, which is ambiguous, and it's impossible to understand unless you understand my thesis of inevitable failure and singular solution. And this is why. This is what he was quoted to have said. Walker gave Jefferson to have said, ostensibly in his final arguments to Alexander Hamilton against creating the first National Bank of the United States, the first central bank, a first so-called Federal Reserve, which is just private entities. Federal Reserve is neither federal nor a reserve of anything, as I've been saying for 40 years. Walker gave Jefferson to have said, quote, to Hamilton, if the American people ever allow the banks to issue their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations which will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Unquote. Now, that, to me, having developed independently by myself, and as I said in the beginning of the story, you know, I was thinking, you know, I had to think this out, and I would find others who had thought it before me, but I never did. And this was the first that I ever heard anything even akin to my own thinking. And, and holy Christ, I mean, I practically jumped out of my seat. You know, I'm thinking, holy shit! I mean, I've snuck in the back of this auditorium, and it's, you know, I mean, I studied American history. You know, I'm a student of the Constitution. You know, and it's got it advocates a precious metal monetary standard. Mm-hmm. You know, this is phenomenal. If Jefferson ever said this is phenomenal. Now, academia denies it, but there's, of course, many things much like it that he said against banks. But at the same time that, you know, Walker gave this quote, I was incredulous. I was shocked. We had a situation here where it's quite possible then, well, it's probable that the founding fathers were very close to mathematically perfected economy if they hadn't got there. He's identifying the problem, but he's identifying it in such ambiguous terms as are relatively useless to actually solve the problem. But all you would have to do, and as a writer, I do. There isn't anything that I ever write that you know that's serious that I don't read myself 50 times, you know, without changing it. You know, that may mean I read the same sentence, and this is, people will shake their heads and think this is impossible. But I often read the same sentence hundreds of times. You know, anyway. It's probable that the founders were on the heels of this, but yet they did nothing of the kind in the Constitution. They don't even give us a monetary system. You know, did they compromise? What was the reason? How was it that this thinking was somehow purged from that eventual document? I mean, people who've known me for a long time, you know, sooner or later they're shaking their heads and they're thinking, my God, if you ever had the chance to explain these things to Thomas Jefferson, what would the world be like today? You know. Anyway, you know, so how do we understand this? That means absolutely nothing, even, you know, to any economist, to anyone who hasn't unraveled this issue of an implicit obligation to maintain a vital circulation by perpetually reborrowing interest and principal as a new debt equal to the former debt, thus perpetually escalating the sum of debt until we're dispossessed of everything, just as this quote says, you see. And this was really my introduction to intense study of history, which discovered, frankly, nothing more than was exposed by this man's presentation. If this man and I never met, the world would be, you know, very different. The future world would be very different. Anyway, so what this means is that there's an inherent deflationary aspect of this obfuscation of the currency, and that is that it's an obligation to pay out of a circulation which at most consists of some remaining principal, all the remaining principal and interest together that's ever charged for that debt, which is mathematically impossible to repay, but by reborrowing interest and principal as a new sum of debt increased by so much as periodic interest. So there's what I prefer to call reflation, which it seems, we can't tell for absolute certain, which seems to be what Jefferson is calling inflation. Now, according to my study of back at least when Benjamin Franklin was a young man and he wrote his paper, Nature and Necessity of a Paper Currency, the terms inflation and deflation weren't even used. They didn't even exist, you know, as pertains to a monetary system. So this is suspect about Jefferson's statement. But nevertheless, if he said this, it amounts to my thesis of inevitable failure. And yet it does so in a curious, ambiguous way. personally, the idea deserves more careful and definitive articulation than that, in my belief. Whether Jefferson was cautious because of political ramifications or whatever, I have no idea. I don't dare make assumptions like that because I have the highest respect for Jefferson. Anyway, this is like it's a revelation, that Jefferson said this. And so this man Jock Walker goes on with this story of Benjamin Franklin in England, which is the core of what I eventually developed into this parable of perfect economy. So it's only possible, and it appears to be at least covered up. The evidence of it existing as Walker gave it, it doesn't exist anymore, at best. And maybe it's a result of a misunderstanding, but I frankly have a difficult time accepting that because its coincidences are just to coincide so perfectly with reality and revelatory facts that it's and that was my first question after this event is over. He finishes this story, which is my parable of perfect economy, and he asks for questions. He's done with the lecture, and I raised I snuck in the back door into the back of this huge auditorium all by myself. I'm in the very back. I'm listening very carefully, and everybody else is up in the front. And I raised my hand immediately when he asked for questions, and I said, you tell this fascinating story, and as if it's better, but you don't teach the principles of it, exactly what would make it better. And, you quote Franklin and you quote Jefferson, and particularly you had Jefferson saying the quote which I just gave, and that is, if the American people ever allow the banks to issue their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations which will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. You give this quote, and what I was wondering is if you understood what he meant by first by inflation and then by deflation. I was wondering if you understood that this story of colonial economy, which you have just given, is practically a mathematically perfected economy. And he just looked at me quizzically, searching his brain for an answer for a while, and then he finally answered. He says, I haven't the slightest idea what you're talking about. So I explained this thesis of an inevitable failure and how it equates to the quote of Jefferson. And then I explained what was wrong with the colonial economy and spending the money into circulation to pay for the bridge, that it was deflationary, that those who consumed of the bridge needed to pay the principal out of circulation in proportion to their consumption of the bridge, and then everything was right. And of course, I used to explain when I finished this story, as he told it, which tells how to fund government without taxation, which seems to be a glorious thing, and it is. I mean, if you read my parable of perfect economy, after I was apprised by academia, I mean, we're talking several college professors notify me that Jefferson never said any such thing and that the story's a bunch of crap. And so I thought, well, that's terrible. How could that be? And I'd been searching madly for the sources ever since I left Alaska, I've never found them since, even. And so I thought it was curious, and of course to be informed of this, it seemed like a perfect fitting history. And then I thought about what to do about it, and of course what I did, I'd been telling it for, 5 years already at that time, that, and it was just a fantastic teaching vehicle. People got it. It related to the founders, And then I'm notified of this, and this is a story I don't want to throw away. And then I got to thinking, I said, that means the only thing that I can do with it, if I'm going to use it, is call it a parable and explain that it is a parable. And so that's what I did. And so when you read, The Debt Virus by Jacques Jacquerin, he actually